Welcome to the Mental Minute, an AI-generated podcast. Today, we are going to be diving into, well, a pretty brainy idea, I think it's safe to say.
Yeah.
It's called Goodhart's Law.
Okay.
And it basically states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So it sounds pretty simple on the surface, right?
Yeah.
But trust me, this little nugget, which is
yeah.
credited to the British economist Charles Goodhart, throws a surprisingly long shadow.
It does. It does.
So let's
It really does.
let's sort of unpack that a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Right.
So I think it's really interesting to think about the origins of this because this wasn't just like some sort of like a late night, epiphany that Goodhart had. Goodhart back in 1975 was actually looking at the UK's monetary policy.
Okay.
And and he observed this tendency for any sort of statistical regularity to just fall apart the moment you try to control it with that regularity.
Yeah.
So you can kind of think of it, I always think of it like trying to squeeze a balloon,
Yeah.
You push in one place and it just pops out somewhere else.
Yeah, totally.
And so initially this was actually a critique of how the Thatcher government was trying to manage the economy.
Okay, so this was really grounded in economics from the get-go.
Absolutely. Economics was ground zero for this insight, yeah.
But it sounds like, this wasn't totally a brand new thought, right?
Yeah.
Like other thinkers had sort of sensed something similar before, right?
Absolutely. So while Goodhart gets the credit for the catchy phrasing for that time, the underlying idea had been kicking around.
Okay.
Campbell's Law in 1969 pointed out that, the more we use a number for social decisions, the more likely it is to get corrupted.
Okay.
And then you have Jerome Rivette's, a bit later in 1971, talking about, focusing solely on metrics in complex systems can lead to those systems being, gamed,
Right.
It's that human element, isn't it? That once we know how we're being judged, we tend to adjust our behavior.
It's like we're all just trying to, level up in the game of life.
Totally.
And if the rules are too focused on one specific score, we might ignore the actual gameplay, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You also mentioned the Lucas critique earlier. How does that tie into this?
So the Lucas critique, which also kind of came about around the same time, adds another layer to this.
Okay.
It basically says that we can't just use past data to predict what'll happen when we change policies.
Yeah.
Because the very act of setting a target can change how people behave.
Interesting.
Which makes those old patterns unreliable. And then also in economics, you have the concept of rational expectations, which also sort of dances around this a little bit. So people aren't passive. They adjust their actions to maximize their rewards within the new system, right?
Right.
So if you incentivize, let's say, hitting a specific sales number, people will find ways to hit that number, even if it means offering like unsustainable discounts.
Right.
You see this all the time.
Yeah, definitely. So we see how this is really rooted in economics, right?
Yes.
But how did this idea about monetary policy specifically, broaden out to become this almost, universal observation, it feels like?
Well, I think that thinkers in other fields really started to recognize the core principle at play here.
Okay.
Keith Hoskin, back in the mid-90s, argued that Goodhart's Law was actually becoming a defining feature of our times, especially with this increasing emphasis on accountability.
Accountability, yeah.
So he saw this as a natural consequence of trying to measure and quantify everything.
Right, and once that number is tied to a reward or a punishment, it really takes on a life of its own.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Marilyn Strathern, around the same time, gave us that really succinct phrasing that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Right.
And she even traces back to the history of accounting in, 19th century Britain, noting how this focus on measurable increases as a sign of progress, right, led to our modern obsession with accountability.
Interesting.
So it's that shift from the measure reflecting reality to the measure becoming the reality that I think really causes the trouble.
Yeah, it's not measuring. That's the problem, necessarily.
Wow.
It's when we fixate on the measurement as the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
So I think it would be really helpful to kind of dive into some real-world examples here.
Absolutely.
You mentioned research assessment.
Yes.
How does that work?
So the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment actually pushes back against this in the scientific community.
Okay.
And they talk about, for instance, the H-index, which tries to gauge a researcher's influence has actually seen its correlation with actual scientific breakthroughs decrease.
Oh, wow.
As people have started to game the system.
Interesting.
So, more publications,
Yeah.
potentially less impactful work, increased self-citation.
So really trying to juice that number
Exactly.
as opposed to doing
Yeah.
the actual, research.
The metric becomes the target, sometimes at the expense of truly innovative research.
Right. So quality is taking a backseat to quantity, driven by that metric.
Yeah.
Makes sense. What about in the world of conservation?
So the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, provides a fascinating example.
Okay.
They have this classification of extinction risk, but because labeling a species as extinct can actually trigger changes in environmental protections, the IUCN has actually become very cautious about using that label.
So almost the opposite of what you'd expect.
Yeah, because the measure itself,
Yeah.
which is designed to guide conservation efforts, becomes this high-stakes target, and it can actually influence the very classification it was supposed to, objectively reflect.
So it's like the fear of the consequences of the measurement changes how we apply the measurement.
Totally.
Kind of a catch-22, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
What about healthcare?
Oh, healthcare, absolutely.
Healthcare must have its own version of the test.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So, hospitals that aim to reduce, let's say, the average length of stay.
Right.
Or LOS, right? It's a very common efficiency metric. They might feel this pressure to discharge patients quicker. And while a shorter LOS can look really good on paper, the unintended consequence of this is that you can have more patients being readmitted to the emergency room shortly after.
Right.
So the focus on the single number, LOS, can overshadow the real goal, which is ensuring patients are truly well enough to go home.
Right, yeah. And then, of course, we saw this, really dramatically, I would say, during the, early scramble of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that push for hitting these testing numbers.
Exactly.
Tell me about that.
So, the British government, for example, set this very ambitious target of 100,000 COVID-19 tests per day.
Right.
Initially, it was about the number of tests performed, but later shifted to capacity to perform that many. And so the headline number really became the focus, sometimes at the expense of whether those tests were actually the most useful diagnostic tests in the right places.
It really is. Almost a predictable pattern, isn't it?
It is. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. Speaking of predictable patterns, you mentioned the TV show, The Wire, earlier.
Yeah.
How does a gritty crime drama illustrate this economic principle?
So The Wire, surprisingly, offers this really insightful fictional parallel.
Okay.
So the character Presbo, right, former cop who becomes a teacher, makes this direct comparison between schools, teaching to the test to boost standardized test scores, and the police department's practice of, quote, juking the stats, which is manipulating crime statistics to show better numbers.
So in both cases, it's this intense focus on improving the metrics that doesn't actually translate to real improvements.
Yeah, the measures become the targets, and the underlying purpose is undermined.
I love that.
It's a really powerful way to see how this law kind of operates across very different fields.
It really brings it to life.
It does.
And you also touched on some related ideas that kind of highlight these different facets of the problem. Campbell's law, which we mentioned, and the Cobra effect.
The Cobra effect.
Tell me about that.
Classic example of unintended consequences. So legend has it that the British government in India was trying to reduce the cobra population by offering a bounty for every dead cobra.
Makes sense.
Seems like a good idea, right?
Yeah.
Well, what happened was clever folks started breeding cobras to cash in.
Oh, no.
And when the government scrapped the program, they released all these extra cobras, making the problem even worse.
So it had the opposite of the intended effect.
A well-intentioned metric, leading to the exact opposite.
Of the intended outcome.
Wow, that's amazing. And then, we revisited the Lucas critique as well, highlighting that danger of over-relying on past data when we're setting these targets.
Precisely.
And then we have metric fixation, which is just this tendency to become overly focused on specific metrics when making decisions, and we ignore other crucial factors. And then surrogation, which is when the measure effectively replaces the real thing that we actually care about.
Right.
So think of like a company whose stock price becomes the only measure of its success, even if, let's say, innovation and employee morale are tanking.
The proxy becomes the focus.
The proxy becomes the focus, exactly.
So from economics to education pest control gone wrong. Goodhart's law really seems to be lurking everywhere, doesn't it?
It is pervasive.
It really is.
It really is. And I think the core message here is that while measurement is often necessary, right?
Yeah.
We have to be incredibly careful about what happens when those measures become the be-all and end-all, because the pressure to hit targets can really warp behavior and lead to some, very unexpected and often undesirable results.
Absolutely. It makes you really think about all the metrics that we're encountering daily, right? In our jobs, even in our personal lives. Where might we be unintentionally turning a useful measure into a potentially misleading target?
That's the crucial takeaway here, I think. How can we design systems of evaluation and accountability that actually reflect what we value without them becoming distorted targets themselves?
Right.
Is it possible to truly measure progress and success in a way that resists this inevitable pressure to be gamed?
That's the question, isn't it?
That's the question.
Really something to chew on.
It is. It is.
Thanks for listening.